Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. To give a little context to who I am, who we are, and the conversations that I have with amazing guests, I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail in times of crisis. My experience with some of the wealthiest families in the world has allowed me to distill best practices for discovering purpose, refining vision, governance structures, systems, processes, and culture that successful families and their safeguard family offices need in order to thrive. I help families create or reinvent their family office to be of institutional quality and highly adaptive. Many of you have heard me this summer, although not go into great detail, talk about how truly significant families, whether they're here in the US or international, often at least explore the opportunity of buying or creating effectively an insurance company. It's a highly complex field. And in the hour to hour and 10 minutes we're going to have today, we're going to make great inroads. It's going to be very valuable. But there are going to be some things we're just not going to have the time to get to, but that will make it exciting to have our special guest on one or two more times, really dedicated to this incredible subject. And when I mentioned this summer in my master classes about private banking offshore that families could own or control, and insurance companies. And again, this is the feedback I've been getting back from multi-billion-dollar families about some of their kind of inside secrets and things that they do, mainly on a diversity and wealth preservation perspective. And I said earlier, solving problems and mitigating risk. And potentially, this is one solution for certain families that could be a good fit. So what we're titling our subject today is Advantages for the Ultra Wealthy in Creating or Buying Offshore Insurers. It's a little bit of a broad title relative to how deep we're going to get into, more so on the reinsurance industry. It features Ed Renn, partner at Withers Bergman, and Ryan LaRusso, associate at Withers Bergman. Many of you know Withers, and Ed has been on several times before, as one of the world's premier global tax and estate firms, and I do mean global. So we're very excited to have both Ed and Ryan on the show. Gentlemen, welcome.
Happy to be here, Angelo. Thank you for having us.
It's my pleasure. Let's get to it. Can you provide a little background on, let's even start with hedge fund reinsurance, when it got started, and what was it intended to even achieve?
Okay, that's a great place to start. I mean, I think realistically, that's late 80s or early 1990s in terms of the time frame. And what was intended was, hedge funds, particularly hedge funds, if we go back 20 or 30 years ago, very often had very short holding periods, so a lot of short-term capital gain in most of their investment structures. Because short-term capital gains are taxed as ordinary income and are taxes due annually, taking and wrapping those investments into the capital structure of an insurance company, which isn't taxed in quite the same fashion, basically allowed income tax deferral, and it also allowed the conversion ultimately of ordinary income into capital gains, because you didn't have a flow-through entity. It was a corporation, offshore, wasn't taxed by the US for certain periods of time, came within certain exceptions, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about PFICs and CFCs later on. But the reality is you took what would have otherwise been short-term ordinary income, postponed the taxation to when you actually wanted to dispose of the insurance company interest, and converted ordinary into capital gain.
Yes. And again, everyone, I'm going to remind everyone, this is a great subject. It is very complex and detailed. And we're going to focus more on today on the opportunities, as I just said, kind of reinsurance, and really specifically as the hedge fund industry kind of originated decades ago and has been a tremendously powerful vehicle for them. There are opportunities for significant families, those with business interest, et cetera, to do variations of that. We may get a little bit into kind of its cousin to some degree, captive insurers, and even things like private placement life insurance and how that could potentially loop in and play into this or potentially be an alternative. So simply stay with us. I know it's going to be a rather technical subject. Gentlemen, could you talk a little bit about what a typical structure might look like?
Yeah, sure. The way it would typically be done is you have a US-based hedge fund that would set up an offshore reinsurance company in a foreign jurisdiction that did a lot of insurance. That might be Bermuda or maybe the Caymans, but Bermuda was commonly used because of the insurance regulator experience there. And the fund would be the insurance company would be structured in a way so that, again, it gets technical and we'll get more into it, but so it avoided current taxation to the U.S. Investors in the hedge fund under the U.S. anti-deferral rules, the CFC regime or the Controlled Foreign Corporation regime, and the PFIC regime. If you felt, because both of those regimes have insurance exceptions, but the main way it was done is you want to avoid being a CFC for reasons we'll talk about, and then when you did qualify as a passive foreign investment company, or you'd otherwise be a passive foreign investment company, you could rely on what was called the insurance company exception. And so the investors in the US fund wouldn't be subject to current tax until the cash got returned to them. And often there was foreign investors involved. And what you were really trying to do was keep US ownership under certain thresholds in terms of the CFC rules, and we'll talk a little more about that. And then have enough insurance business so as to qualify as for the insurance company exception. And the big question there was how much insurance business was enough to qualify, and how active did you need to be? And there was differing opinions on that among sometimes the company setting them up, the hedge funds, and the IRS. And the IRS often felt that the amount of insurance activity wasn't, they would often analogize to a US commercial insurer and say, this isn't quite there. And, there was disagreement among the tax professionals and other people involved in the structures as to how much was enough. So.
And basically the last 20 years, Angelo, there's been the IRS has been requiring more and more in the way of actual insurance activities. So, we usually, when a client initially approaches us on this, we want to make sure that they actually want to be in the insurance business, because this isn't simply take an investment and put a wrapper around it. This really does require the desire to be an insurer or a reinsurer, and you need to have people on the ground. There's investment. There's real activity that needs to take place.
There's people selling the policies. Part of the pressure point came, the question with insurance is always, how much capital is enough? Because on one hand, a lot of capital looks safe. You're going to be able to pay the claims, but because it allowed deferral of investment income, the test was, how much investment income is too much relative to the insurance activities. And so the question kind of turned on it indirectly. Did you get your capital from premiums, or did you get your capital from initial funding by the investor or the person setting it up? And if it wasn't enough coming in from premiums, you started to have a bit of a problem.
And in the early years, that was very often the case. As the rules were evolving, it was very, very normal to have very little insurance activity and lots of investment activity. But that's changed over the last 20 years.
Yes, and understandable. And I know we dived pretty deeply into some technical aspects. So I'm going to take a little bit of a pullback, because some people, and I understand, I would have been this way as well, are Okay, you jumped right into reinsurance companies. You mentioned 2 or 3 times kind of hedge fund reinsurer, but Angelo, we're an ultra high net worth family, a family office. Is this only applicable to investment structures that are a hedge fund? And even if that is the case, that's just the vernacular. It's a term. Even I don't quite know exactly what that means. I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but it's true. Henceforth, how would a wealthy family, would they need to have business interests? Could it simply be on the investing side? How would some of that structuring flow or be diagrammed out?
Well, Angelo, one of the reasons why the hedge funds went into the reinsurance business is they had a diverse enough body of U.S. shareholders that they wouldn't run afoul of certain rules. And if a family decided that they wanted to set up a reinsurance corporation on their own, and it was literally one entity, let's say, they would be a controlled foreign corporation, and they'd face some pretty adverse tax consequences with that structure. If you could get into a scenario where there was more less concentrated positions, but again, primarily U.S. folks, you might find that you're under the PFIC regime. The nice thing about the hedge funds is they had enough underlying shareholders that generally they didn't trigger either of those two negative, what Ryan called the anti-deferral regimes. The IRS figured out a long time ago that folks could go offshore, set up a corporation in a non-tax jurisdiction, and invest and ultimately pay very little or no tax. So they came up with various anti-deferral regimes to prevent that. And depending on how far back you go in time, the regimes start to kick in. I mean, the PFIC regime actually succeeded the CFC regime and that kind of thing. But the reality is you need diverse shareholdings to avoid tax consequences that are probably worse than not doing this planning, frankly.
Okay, then I'm going to have to dive a little bit into that because it technically is reinsurance. Does that simply mean that they're going to have professionals on board in the reinsurance company that are real insurance company executives that are going to look to be kind of commercial in terms of taking in relationships where they're legitimately providing reinsurance, and then the profit inside the quote unquote hedge fund reinsurance company is going to be on the quality of underwriting, also combined with the quality of investing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You have to want to be in the insurance business. The structures that are successful have real insurance executives that are experienced in the industry, understand the underwriting, can decide what policies to write and what risks to undertake. And it's really, if you're going to be successful at it, it's insurance driven first. There's tax advantages, but it's insurance driven. You don't want to put the cart before the horse and say, well, I'll do insurance because there's tax breaks. You need to understand the insurance, and if you can do that, then you can structure it efficiently. And there's a couple of reasons that reinsurance has been more favored. I mean, one is some of the heavier lifting is done by, the fronting carrier, so you don't have to have quite the same staff size and undertaking as if you were,
doing it all yourself.
Yeah, doing it all yourself in terms of getting the policy. So some of that risk, some of those jobs are handled by the fronting carrier. And the other benefit is the excise tax, because if you're writing a premium to a foreign insurer, there's a federal excise tax that kicks in, and it's at different levels. And if it's on property, because the insurance code breaks insurance into two different kinds of coverage. One is life and health, and then you have property and casualty. And if you write property and casualty, it's a 4% excise tax on reinsurance premium paid to a foreign insurer. So that's a significant number. Life is 1%, but reinsurance on property and casualty is 1%. So you're saving 3% on gross premium by going to reinsurance in terms of the federal excise tax. So for those two reasons, reinsurance has been favored to direct P&C underwriting. And there's so many domestic companies that do domestic P&C underwriting, you probably wouldn't want to set up your own shop and start competing. It's a crowded market.
And in terms of digging into that from kind of a foundational level, although I kind of hinted at it many, many years ago, decades ago, I used to work at a insurance company that was more focused on the P&C side. That's industry talk for property and casualty. And I'm always interested in how businesses work. And when I went to the home office for a visit, they're basically like, oh yeah, sometimes we just about break even, maybe even lose a little bit of money. For every dollar we take in, maybe we're paying out $1.01. And then I'm scratching my head, then this doesn't sound like a great business to be in relative to underwriting premiums and claims paid out. But they reminded me that there's, the science and art, the arbitrage of what we're allowed to invest in. And this was a different era decades ago, but like we're making 12, 13% on our investment. Henceforth, it's still very net profitable for us, even if we are at a slight loss. We would rather not be. We would rather be at a slight gain from an underwriting perspective, but it's not necessarily needed. Is that spread that I just described that is not paid out in claims, does that accrue inside a reinsurance company tax favored?
If you're offshore, well, in a U.S. company, if you just to start with the U.S. company, no, the U.S. company is going to get taxed on underwriting income and investment income. If you move offshore, yeah, you get the deferral. Because if you're in a jurisdiction that doesn't impose tax, and you're a C corporation for tax purposes, and this is where the anti-deferral regimes come in, and compliance with them is important. But if you say, well, I'm an offshore C corporation, I have no entity level, corporate level tax in the jurisdiction I'm set up in, so I can turn my investment portfolio without current taxation. Tax is then imposed when the cash comes out to the owners. At the dividend rates. But the question then becomes, well, have I avoided current taxation to my U.S. shareholders under what we call the anti-deferral rules, which is the controlled foreign corporation and the PFIC rules? Because if you don't fall within those exceptions, all the owners will be taxed currently on both the underwriting and investment income.
Ryan, let's define how we would think of as a controlled foreign corporation.
Yeah, so controlled foreign the definition has changed a little bit, but the CFC rules came into place in 1962, and they didn't change much until 2017. But a controlled foreign corporation is any foreign corporation owned by 50%, more than 50% by U.S. shareholders. And U.S. shareholders were historically U.S. persons with 10% or more of the vote of that corporation. And then in 2017, you got to change so it counted voter value. And one quick point is that for insurance companies, the rule is actually, it's a lower threshold. So instead of being 50% owned by U.S. persons, it can be 25% owned by U.S. shareholders and still be a controlled foreign corporation. And you'd be taxed on your insurance income.
And there's attribution and aggregation rules that apply in terms of determining whether you're that 10% U.S. shareholder.
Right. So families and trusts for the benefit of family members that were U.S. persons would all count towards 10% ownership, and control through various entities like partnerships would count towards determining the 10% threshold and the 50% threshold.
And I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm assuming some of the advantages, besides what we're already talking about, is effectively some of the arbitrage from capital gains, dividends. However, and we had Ed on a couple of weeks ago, what would happen if the Democrats sweep, and just looking at some of their proposals, some of that spread, if I could call it that, it gets a hell of a lot narrower. So are these things that are all in play if you're advising a family, depending on what their core goals are?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that, whether we're talking about reinsurance companies, or whether we're talking about private placement, Angelo. One of the arguments in favor of not doing it has generally been, well, my family basically has long-term holding periods, and mainly we generate capital gain. It's only going to be 20% on the capital gain, maybe another 3.8% on the Obama surcharge. We have capital losses sometimes. We can control the timing. It's really not all that bad. If we get a Biden administration and he does what he tells us he's going to do, that 23.8 is going to go up to 43.4. So it's going to go up by almost 20 whole percentage points. It's a significant increase in capital gain taxation. And if you can shelter that capital gain taxation from either defer it or avoid it entirely, as you possibly could with a PPLI policy or a properly structured offshore company, it might be worth looking at.
So in terms of a family of significance comes to you, and of course we're going to go rarefied air, a multi-billion-dollar family with complex investing, business interest, and a multiple of family members. And, I heard from this guy, Angelo, in his masterclass about the potential advantages of a couple of different things. And one of them he spoke about was insurance companies. Of course, I'll leave the heavy lifting to you guys and all the positive, yet the negative. But what would be, and let's forget about the potential regime change and how that can narrow some of the tax arbitrage and benefits. But assuming they had a legitimate purpose and they're interested in the insurance business for whatever reason, what would be some of the core benefits that they're going to get? Whatever, a multi-billion, a $3 to $5 billion plus family. What could be some of the core benefits they get from doing this?
Well, if a single family came to us, we would probably have to do a deep dive into whether or not we could structure the company in such a way as to avoid the CFC rules. Because typically, if it's all owned by one family, not always, we'd have to sit down and look at their structure, but very often it's all going to be, all the ownership is going to be attributed to one or a few entities, and they're all going to be 10% US shareholders. And it only takes 25% to trigger the CFC rules in an insurance company context. That basically means that all of the deferral that we're intending to get with this structure goes away. We have pretty much immediate taxation, and we lose some of the what is now the advantages of certain types of tax. Right now, we would lose the ability to handle capital gains would be treated as ordinary income under the current regime. If you get a Biden administration, it's going to be the same anyway. There's no loss there. But, so you really have to figure out if the family can hold the structure. We can replicate the same kinds of benefits conceivably using working with the family to develop their own insurance dedicated fund and look at private placement life insurance as a vehicle. And that's, far more approachable to more of your audience. I would assume that just about everybody in your audience would have the financial capital to invest in a significant PPLI policy and potentially get their own IDF.
Yes, my audience is familiar that we've covered, including with you, Ed, although that goes back a couple of years, PPLI and broadly insurance, but especially offshore and specifically PPLI. We will circle back to that a little bit later, and I did jump a little bit ahead on certain things, so pardon me. My audience is probably chuckling because, well, of course, it's Angelo. You expect him to bounce around. I'm looking at one of my questions that I believe we covered, but in trying to maybe go back to it and make sure it's really understood, in 2003, the IRS and Congress voiced some concerns over these structures, which again, we did somewhat go into. But did you want to elaborate relative with some of the questions that I've been asking and, how this all intertwines and why it is so complex?
Yeah. So the IRS, we did touch on it, but the IRS came out with a notice in 2003. It was 2003-34 was the notice, and the biggest concern the IRS had, or it kind of boiled down to this idea that these foreign entities were being set up by U.S. hedge funds, and the IRS was particularly bothered by the fact that often the capital would go from the U.S.-based hedge fund to the foreign insurance company, and then that foreign insurance company might in turn reinvest back into the U.S. hedge fund. Or the investments of the insurance company would be managed by the same people who were managing the assets of the US-based hedge fund. And so because it was structured in such a way as to avoid the anti-deferral regimes, the persons who were investing through the insurance company were getting deferral, no current taxation, and then oftentimes long-term capital gain rates if they could qualify in terms of when they disposed of the investment. And that would have been okay, but the IRS was kind of concerned that the insurance activities weren't substantial enough to qualify for the exception. And so they were seeing things like stop loss arrangements and limited insurance liability. So you could have a company with $500 million of capital and insurance liabilities of $5 to $10 million. Maybe less. It didn't look like it was really in the insurance business. One or two guys managing the fund from Bermuda, but these did not look like the U.S. insurance companies in Hartford that had 8 floors of the commercial building, and so and you had disparate tax treatment for the different persons investing. And so the IRS came out with a notice that kind of said, well, we're going to look at this more and we're going to put some pressure on it if we don't think there's enough insurance activity.
And that really went two ways. It went the risk that the companies were taking, that they didn't think some of the risks were particularly real, and that they weren't taking enough risk, that it was too much of an investment wrapper. And, and that continued along. Angelo, we got more guidance in 2015 along the same lines. We got a law change in 2017 as part of TCJA, and we've gotten even more narrow regulation in 2019. There's still proposed regs, but basically, at this point in time, you're going into this business if you want to do insurance business. This is no longer just a wrapper for investments. There has to be a real intent and a real desire to write insurance or write reinsurance.
I knew this question would come up. I'm looking at my text now, so I'll ask it. Effectively, it's, hey, Angelo, I heard, we all know that Warren Buffett owns one of the world's giant reinsurers. He's owned insurance companies since the 60s. And the perception is, as a long-term investor, that he has gotten, and maybe those are a little more past tense, he's gotten tremendous tax benefits. I would think buying private companies and holding on to them, he's inherently going to get some pretty intriguing tax benefits. But basically, that is a question I get a lot. If it's good for Warren, it may be good for me. Where is that kind of right, and where does it fall off the tracks a little bit?
Take that one.
I think I have a couple points on that. Certainly the strategy is similar, right? You get the premium dollars and the capital, and you use it to invest in investments that make you money. And if you're doing good on your underwriting, you'll make some money there. And if you're doing good on your investments, you can make money there. I think Warren's strategy has always been more of a long-term hold. So he's probably less worried about the ordinary income rates and the short-term capital gains rates. I think he generally, holds investments for 10, 20, 30 years. So the strategy is probably a little bit different. And Gen Re is I don't think anyone's questioning whether that's an insurance company. And so,
yeah, I left out the little fact of Warren's insurance companies, Geico, Gen Re, they're insurance companies. They're gigantic organizations. Some of them are public. They have shareholders. And that probably goes back to what you said earlier about hedge funds in their own way, with hedge funds having shareholders. So I don't want to, I'm going to go down a little bit of a slippery slope. And if you want to be careful, I understand relative to your comments. But in following that principle is simply having shareholders. Could you do it as a SPAC? Could you technically make it a public company? Could 10 or 20 families band together? And I know I'm jumping around. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going down the right path, Angelo. If you want to do this, you need diverse ownership. So your idea of having 20 families come together, or actually having a publicly listed security, those kinds of scenarios likely would work very well. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is, we're worried about PFICs and we're worried about CFCs for U.S. families. If a family is an international family and they don't have very much in the way of U.S. contact, or the non-U.S. branch of the family is going to run this enterprise, it has a whole different set of rules and ramifications. So, if you're doing this for a family that's still primarily in Brazil, and the U.S. members of the family are not going to have much or any investment in this, it could be a terrific strategy.
Yes, you actually beat me to the punch of my next question. We are looking at it from the perspective of U.S.-based citizens, but Withers is certainly a global firm. I've never been more global than I am now. And every country is going to be different with their complexities of their tax regime. But in most, I'm not going to say all, but in most other countries, there appears to be greater freedoms and flexibilities relative to out-of-country offshore ownership. So some of the things that might have been applicable decades ago here in the U.S., in a lot of other countries of domicile, some of these strategies will work. Again, we're not going to talk about specific countries, but they'll work more aggressively from the tax perspective for non-U.S. citizens.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that in most respects, the U.S. is the most legislated and regulated insurance environment out there. I saw one of your audience members, I caught her question. She was saying, well, what kind of risks can you actually hold in this company? The funny thing is, I mean, I think there's finally now a definition of insurance in the code, but it's only been in there for a few years. It's a little bit like, you know it when you see it. Anything that's properly insurance, anything that's risk shifting, it will qualify. But as Ryan pointed out, normally there is a delineation between life insurance and health insurance risks and property and casualty type risks. But property and casualty covers all kinds of things, from special insurance for floating oil rigs, to crop insurance, to insuring a fleet of trucks. I mean, anything you can think of, really.
Yeah. The only the one point I would add is the IRS has sometimes taken a little bit more narrow view on the P&C side as to what's going to be insurance for federal income tax purposes, and the things that they've kind of tried to differentiate is things that are insurance risk, quote unquote, versus business risk. And business risk being things like that look a little bit like timing and investment risk, but they've also sometimes extended it to things like business interruption. And so the closer you get to that kind of timing investment related risk, the less you're going to have, the less chance you're going to have of prevailing that it's property and casualty. And then if you don't have an insurance risk, you fail the insurance company test. And if you fail that test, then you're back to being a PFIC, at least with respect to the U.S. persons that own an interest in the
So
structure.
Ryan, if I'm an insurance company and if I'm a car sales company, I'm an auto dealership, and my big sales day is President's Day. And, I'm in the north part of the United States, so there's always some weather risk. If I take out a policy ensuring that it won't snow more than 2 inches on President's Day, so my customers will come and take advantage of my President's Day sale. Is that business risk or is that insurance risk?
Yeah, there's nothing that really is particularly well defined on that, but yeah, that's kind of the type of
That's on the
situation
line.
where you're getting on the
Yeah.
line, and you'd have to think about whether you really have insurance there. And if you have enough other risks that are clearly insurance, you don't need to worry about being an insurance company. But if the only thing your insurance company insures is weather risk on President's Day, then you have a real chance of the IRS saying, no, this is not an insurance company, and you failed the test, and now your U.S. shareholders are shareholders in the PFIC, and you lose the deferral benefits, and you have the PFIC regime to contend with, which is
Complicated.
not complicated and not what you want.
To say the least. We are getting some questions in, and they're a little complex. I'm going to perhaps go through them now. I'm looking at the first one, and you already saw one of them, but if you scroll upwards, you'll see I'm going to read it for those that will hear this in a podcast. If someone is dual citizens, they say, being American in the least, how would they be counted for the purpose of illustrating above for 50% share purpose? Why don't I stop there and let you answer that part of it?
Dual's going to count.
Yeah, unless you're going to file a like a treaty tiebreak type claim. So you have a real issue where if you're a U.S. citizen, you're going to be treated as a U.S. person. And I think I'm trying to remember, can a citizen claim a treaty tiebreak?
No, you got to be a resident.
So if you are a dual citizen, you're going to count. Yeah.
And I'm looking at her second question, which I think we already covered, but why don't I repeat it? That would be on the front end. The back end is such an incredible tax saving vehicle, these insurers, where anything grown from within the pot is not taxable, not even from the long-term capital gains, but that's a pretty optimistic view. Unfortunately, that's not perfectly true how she asked it, correct?
Correct, but I could almost argue that statement would be true of a PPLI policy.
Yes, which again, a little bit of the secret sauce here, which you heard twice already mentioned, is perhaps for 95% of you looking in these kind of solutions, and you should be looking, exploring, and learning, probably the PPLI is going to be the greater solution for the vast, vast majority. Unless you, like Ed and Ryan have said, you really want to get involved legitimately, quote unquote, in the insurance business. And maybe, like Warren elected to do decades ago, maybe you do, and that could be fine. Is there a limit qualitatively and quantitatively in terms of what premium can be invested into, was another question.
Yeah. Well, the limit is it's going to be in terms of, so the insurance company gets a bunch of premium dollars, and what can they do with them? Normally that's going to be dealt with by the regulator in the particular jurisdiction. Regulators typically like to see investments that are more on the liquid side because, for obvious reasons, if there's a claim, the insurance company needs to be able to turn them to cash to pay the claim. Things like real estate do not work, as a general rule, because you can't convert them to premium dollars. Generally not a hard and fast rule on that. Depends on the regulator, but you could expect more liquid. The one quantitative rule, which is related to that question, is in order to now be an insurance company, for purposes of the PFIC exception, not under the U.S. Code generally. So you can be an insurance company. There's not a specific amount of a specific numerical test, but the one numerical test that's in play now is if you're a passive foreign investment company or would otherwise be one, and you want to qualify as an insurance company, your insurance liabilities generally have to be at least 25% of your total assets. There's another facts and circumstances test, but generally suffice it to say that you got to have at least 25% of your liabilities. Insurance liabilities should be at least 25% of your total assets, or else you're going to have trouble qualifying as an insurance company.
And the exception for that is if you're closing an insurance company down or you've got rating issues.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So, it's, but, you can look at most of these hedge fund reinsurance companies. They're running portfolios that are identical to or fairly similar to the portfolios are running in their hedge funds, Angelo. So it's not, it's not, I mean, Ryan's right. Generally, they like to see liquid investments and solid investments. And, you think of bonds when you think of insurance companies. But that said, clearly the hedge fund reinsurance companies have been primarily equity and have had a speculative bent to them.
And we mentioned, the acronym PFIC, and we have covered it, PFIC, and how that interplays, if you wanted to put a little bit of a bow on PFIC, relative to also from a couple of years ago in December, if I remember correctly, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I mean, there's a lot of unique interplay here that, again, gets a little complex regulatory and tax perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see why an insurance company, a PFIC is a passive foreign investment company. So it's passive investments held in a corporate form. And it's easy to see how an insurance company is that. If you're basically investing, those are typically passive activities, and you're in a corporate form, you're a PFIC. But there's exceptions out for active businesses. The CFC rules we described don't have that active passive requirement. But if you were manufacturing widgets and you really were doing the majority of your business manufacturing widgets, we wouldn't worry about the PFIC rules. If you shut down your widget manufacturing business and started to hold investments with what you'd earned as a widget manufacturer, then you'd start to tip into the PFIC regime.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the PFIC regime. Just to step back, the goal here was, can I get deferral on the capital gains? And when this originally started, in terms of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so you could sit back and say to yourself, well, how can I hold my investments in a foreign corporation so as to get deferral without being subject to current taxation or adverse interest charges under the PFIC regime? Well, one exception was the insurance company exception. So I can hold my assets in a foreign corporation, not one person, but a number of people diversified can hold their assets in a foreign corporation, get deferral so long as they have enough insurance. But there wasn't a specific test. So when the original hedge fund insurance test came up, or hedge fund insurance structures came up, there was no specific test that said, well, you need to have this much in insurance liabilities to be an insurance company. It was facts and circumstances. And so there was disagreement over, how much insurance was enough or what really it meant by to be in the insurance business. Did you just have to write the premium? Did you need to have liabilities? 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act came along and said, no, you're going to have a certain amount of liabilities on your books to qualify as an insurance company. And that's a big deal because in order to have a liability on your books, the claim has to be incurred in that year. You can't just be a catastrophe reinsurer and maybe you pay claims once every 4 years or 5 years. You're going to have no liabilities on your books in the interim, and you won't be able to qualify as for the exception unless maybe you try to squeeze into the alternative test, but it's going to be kind of a long shot. So,
and the IRS doesn't really like those sort of black swan premiums anyway. I mean, even in the captive space, I think it's perfectly reasonable to insure, for a family that owns 10 office buildings within 20 blocks of one another in Manhattan, to have dirty bomb coverage. But that said, the IRS is going to say that's almost never going to happen. And they're going to, they'd much rather see me insuring workers' comp claims or a truck fleet where I'm going to have a fair amount of fender benders, things like that. They like they like to see claims being processed as proof that you really are an active insurance business.
Yeah, that actually was one of my questions. My audience is used to hearing me talk about, tiny chance of happening, but utterly disastrous black swan type events. And potentially, if it's hard to get commercially, could creating, and we didn't really have a chance today to get into captives on a smaller level, but reinsurance, maybe, but you're probably pushing the envelope a little bit, at least if you're a US citizen, depending on, is that the only thing you're doing and covering, or is it maybe a tiny part of an overall, again, quote unquote, a true business? And that goes back, and questions still coming in on Warren. Again, it's not really Warren, it's Berkshire Hathaway, a professional investment company. Even though Warren's incredibly rich, the money in Berkshire way is more than his share of it. But we keep on calling it Warren Buffett. Really, it's Berkshire Hathaway. It's a public company. It's an organization that strategically invests. And again, is it possible for other billion-dollar families to create such entities? It is, but do they really? Again, he's Warren, and he's been doing it for 50 plus years.
The key thing, and I'm sure the vast majority of our audience gets it, but those are domestic structures.
Yeah, that's another part of it. Correct. Those are strictly domestic structures. There is another question, which is always one I hate to bring up the word transfer pricing because that could get wickedly complex on the accounting side, but she is asking it. Andrea, you're asking tough questions today. Thanks for the chalk. Good, full of info. Another thing I hear about is transfer pricing. Would you mind fleshing that out a bit as it pertains to the context of reinsurance? Good luck, guys. That's a tough one.
That is a tough one. I think there's a couple of points. One is you're going to have the actual kind of, reinsurance between the fronting carrier and the reinsurer. So you have one, transfer pricing normally applies in a situation where you have related entities. And the question is, is the pricing of the services or the goods being transferred among related entities reasonable and commercial, with the IRS concern being that, you can kind of play games among related entities because it's all one pot. So, there's some temptation to kind of skew things so that it's favorable, but maybe not exactly commercial. If you're dealing with insurance companies, the question would be on, are the two insurance companies where you have the fronting carrier and a related reinsurer, is there transfer pricing issues between the fronter and the reinsurer? A lot of these structures, they're going to be unrelated. And so the transfer pricing concern really won't come up because you're going to have parties dealing with each other on an arm's length basis. The transfer pricing could come up if you have an offshore reinsurer and it's paying for services, or paying related parties to engage in certain management of its insurance operations.
And that's actually one of the ways the IRS has tightened up on insurance regulation. You used to be able to use independent contractors to do an awful lot of things. You can use related parties still, at least under the 2019 proposed regs, but independent contractors are not necessarily going to help you prove that you're running an insurance business.
Yeah, you really, that's exactly right. And, if you're really talking about a payment from a foreign insurance company to a foreign related entity, or you really don't have too many transfer pricing concerns, at least from a U.S. income tax perspective.
Yeah.
Maybe if you have cash coming into the U.S.
Well, Andrea, if we're not understanding your question, just feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'll be happy to talk it through. But I think that's about the best we're going to do today.
Yeah. Any question on transfer pricing always makes me cringe a little bit. I'm surprised I even asked it and brought it up. I probably wanted to torture you guys a little bit. Let's talk about some possible alternatives that compared to what we're talking about now are actually relatively straightforward and easy. I'm going to save the big one, which we've already hinted at, for about 2 or 3 more minutes, but I think we should give a little love, although I think it's less valuable for a $1 billion plus family. But if we could maybe do a brief recap of, there is something called a captive insurer that for especially legitimate business owning families could be a good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Ryan explain the 2 types of captives, but I want to make one basic overarching observation. When we talk to clients about captives, it's about risk management. It's not about tax planning. I mean, this is really about getting some insurance that's either favorably priced, you are a good risk, but you are being tarred by other bad risks, so you're paying way too much for your coverage and you're never making the claim. And I mean, I can go back 10 or 15 years. There used to be a requirement that every physician, emergency room physician in Texas, had $250,000 of coverage, and it basically cost about $235,000 to get that $250,000 of coverage. And, you know, they basically, the better emergency room docs got together and said, you know, we don't have claims. Why are we basically turning over $250,000 a year to the insurance company? And they went off on their own. That's one of the observations. The second thing is, I mean, you will see people out there selling these things basically as tax shelters. And though you can deduct significant premium, and you can basically keep it in family coffers, there's got to be a real risk reason. You've got to have the business case before you have the tax case for a captive, at least in my mind. But Ryan, do you want to explain 831As and 831Bs?
Yeah, sure. And you know, the one other point just to differentiate, right? Because like Ed said, a captive is about risk management. So it's really about insurance of maybe a family enterprise's risks that are contained within the structure. If you're talking about comparing that to an offshore reinsurance structure, you're now talking about taking on external risks. So if you're doing a reinsurance, that's really because you think that there's favorable pricing in terms of external risks in the market and taking on that type of underwriting. If you're doing a captive insurance structure, it's about improving your family's risk management for risks that you have that you feel like maybe aren't being priced properly by the commercial markets, and you could do better managing them yourselves, or you gain some value from managing them. And the 2 ways you do that are, or the way you do that is you set up what's called a captive insurance company, and that insurance company will write premiums to the related family entities, usually brother, sister entities, not the parent for structuring reasons. But the captives get categorized as either one or 2 types of entities. One is called an 831A captive in reference to the code section under which it's taxed, and the other is an 831B. And 831B is a small captive insurance company, so you have to be under a certain amount of premium. It's currently 2.3 million or something, adjusted for inflation. But the IRS has put pressure on 831Bs because they've been seen as a bit of a tax play, because related entities would deduct the premium, so they would pay over, say, $1 million in premium, get a deduction, and the 831B does not have to take that amount into income when it receives it. So you get this permanent tax break. It's not deferral, it's permanent. It's a deduction on one side and not income on the other. And that's okay, but the insurance has to be real and the pricing has to look commercial, so you have to have good actuarial. But they've been under a lot of pressure and scrutiny from the IRS because premiums were mispriced and risks looked esoteric, and there's been a lot of litigation on that. 831A can have any amount of premium, no limits. And so for bigger family enterprises, they make sense in terms of risk management. You could have $50 million of premium or 10 or 4. The benefit of that is, from a tax perspective, you get a bit of a timing deduction. So if you have a lot of claims among your family enterprises, you can, number one, you can retain the risk. And oftentimes companies
Or
will
part of the risk,
part of it,
reinsure
the high risk layer. Yeah. And if you have claims, you can get an accelerated deduction on the reserves. So there's a bit of a timing deduction. If you're not paying it out yet, if you have a claim outside, you think you're going to have a claim of X amount, You put the reserve up, that's a deduction. Maybe it's paid the next year and it reverses, but there's some timing benefit. There's risk management, and if your underwriting is better than the market thinks, you keep some of the cash.
We're going to get to private placement life insurance in a second. Something just popped in my head. Ed's going to roll his eyes, but I think I have to ask it because it popped in my head. And we have a couple of guests coming up on this between now and year end. And that is some of the challenges back to insurance in general, captive, but probably reinsurance for a U.S. citizen from a tax perspective. Will a lot of that kind of go away if the family and the entity is in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Family.
Well, if the family is not U.S., if the family is Puerto Rican.
Well, I mean, well, they are U.S. because that's a U.S. territory. So if I live in Texas, I make the official move to Puerto Rico. I'm still a U.S. citizen, but my tax on Puerto Rican earned income is much less.
Puerto Rican resident. That's
yes, a Puerto Rican resident.
That's an interesting question.
But well, let's deal with what we know. We know that you probably don't have. You probably still have CFC and PFIC issues in that structure.
Yes, I would think so.
But you probably are, you have some advantages in your reporting. And you'd have to take a look and figure out if you can make it work. I mean, most of the Puerto Rican residence planning requires that you actually do something there, or the individual is there for more than half the year. So, I've had clients that have been in love with the idea until they had found out that they had to do more than show up, 3 days before Christmas and fly out the day after.
And there's really bad hurricanes. Yeah, let's shelf that one. We'll dive into it at future times. But I do think that's an interesting twist that for some people, they may want to explore. But really a big one, if some of the reasons we're talking about, from alternative investments to tax benefits to wealth preservation, I don't think there's anything as encompassing to so much as private placement life insurance. Yesterday, we covered life insurance broadly from a very deep intellectual perspective for significant families with Brad Barros and others. About a month ago, we did a pretty deep dive into PPLI. And I would like to do it with Ed and Ryan again at a future time, maybe later this year, and we'll give that an hour to an hour and a half. But in terms of a possible alternative for some families that may be looking at the creating or buying whatever, a reinsurance or a captive, how private placement life insurance and how you guys could explain that in 3 or 5 minutes, although compared to reinsurance, it's way easier.
Well, I mean, a private placement life insurance policy, Angela, would basically allow a family to put significant capital into an investment pool. As long as they aren't making the investment decisions in that pool, they can basically design it any way they like. You just need you need somebody independent actually making the investments. And for what it depends on your age and your health, but most of the time, particularly after the first year, when once we're done with the excise taxes, you trade taxation for a 1% or 1.25% of the policy value to have the insurance option. And the insurance, you're not taxed on the capital gains, you're not taxed on the ordinary income, and you usually have the ability to borrow out money. It depends on whether or not we're doing something exotic, but with a traditional non-MEC policy, you'd have access to your assets. And the game plan here is to hold the policy until death, because on death, you're going to get all of that money back as tax-free death benefit. The capital gains never get paid. The ordinary income never gets paid. And And effectively, particularly if we get in a world where we don't have a step up in basis after the election, insurance is still going to provide a step up. You're going to get, $50 million in cash or $100 million in cash or whatever the face amount of the policy was and whatever it's grown to. And that's all going to be full basis assets. So I really think that if we do get the blue wave, the Democratic sweep of the House, Senate, and the White House, and they enact what Biden is proposing, there's going to be more of a need than ever for private placement life insurance, and it's going to make sense for a lot more families.
Yes, for sure. It's such a tremendously powerful resource for so many families from so many different angles. And I'm still scratching my head after all these years, 20 plus years in, why it still hasn't really taken off inside the community. And now with taxes likely to go up, there's so many reasons to look at it. I'm going to assume that it's just the complexity that sometimes overwhelms families and their advisors, where simply it's just easy sometimes to say no. Perhaps the stigma on life insurance, perhaps the medical and blood test. Ed, if you have any comment on that, would be helpful.
Yeah, I've always felt that in some cases it's advisors haven't really learned enough about the product, and there seem to be some inherent conflicts. I mean, the traditional life insurance guy wants 120% of first year premium. They're not interested in getting 20 basis points as a tail. Accountants don't always know everything they should know about the product. Investment managers don't want to give up $50 or $100 million of assets under management to go off into an insurance structure. I mean, there's lots of, it takes a fair amount of coordination, and you really do have to put the family's needs first, because a lot of times I really think that it's personal interest of the advisors that are keeping families from doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably better if you say that than I said it, but that probably is the number one reason. It's no longer a lack of knowledge and resources, although some will fall short of that. The areas related to being the conflicts involved, which you would think for a family of truly great wealth, an advantage of having a single family office is you don't really, in theory, have to worry about that. Now, I could get a little cute and say, well, suppose someone's compensation is tied into growth of assets and resources. So yeah, I guess there is some potential even in an SFO for some level of conflict, but these are the things that need to be on the table, need to be discussed in compensation issues. And again, in my opinion, whether legal or not, the SFO executive has a fiduciary standard to do the best thing, at least information-wise, to their client, their family, and what the family decides to do is completely up to them. But certainly, private placement life insurance is a very, very powerful, and variable annuities, although not quite as versatile, meaning private placement variable annuities, but certainly something that could be of value and resource as well. Well, gentlemen, in a little over 1 hour, we actually covered a fair amount of ground. Left some things on the table, but that's more of a reason to come back and revisit many of the things that we discussed. For those people that would like to learn more about this very complex subject or subjects that we covered, Ed and Ryan, how could people learn more about you, your firm, and reach you? Sure.
Our direct dial numbers are 203-974-0343.
Yep, and I'm at 203-974-0367.
And, we're both on Withers Worldwide. So if you want to just go and Google Withers Worldwide and look up Ryan LaRusso or Ed Renn, we're there.
And that's Renn as in R-E-N. And Ryan, if you don't mind, please spell your last name.
That's L-O-R-U-S-S-O.
Great. Well, in wrapping up, everyone, this is an incredibly deep and complex subject, but we had a a great duo and a great 1-2 punch with their firm, Withers Bergman, discussing at least from a 30,000 foot view. So imagine how to get really, really in deep. This is something that I think families of wealth should explore, from captives to reinsurers, and for sure, those active in the investing front on the private placement side that we briefly discussed at the end. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm the founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to the interest globally of successful families and their family offices. We do a significant amount of original proprietary content. Although physical events are on hold because of COVID, we're doing hundreds of events a year, or on pace to, for digital. We've adapted very quickly and very aggressively. And we have a whole series of masterclasses and thought leadership opportunities for our members and our engaged parties. I'm active on social media, on YouTube. We're simply Family Office. We're a Family Office Association on Instagram. And my website, as you could probably tell, is familyofficeassociation.com. And my direct email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Ed and Ryan, thanks so much for being on. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.